Welcome to The Rippling Pages, a podcast on the craft of writing, crafted and curated by me, Liam Bishop. Today, I'm joined by Naomi Wood to talk about her recently published collection of short stories, This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things. After novels about Hemingway's wives in Mrs. Hemingway and Bauhaus love triangle set in the Weimar Republic in The Hiding Game, Naomi has turned her craft to the art of the short story. The tone is at times scathing and then tender as women navigate the unfair demands of the strange corporate worlds of prescriptive work-led therapy sessions, pharmaceutical campaigns for analgesics, and a virtual reality dinosaur chat room. Naomi's novels have been published in 16 countries and have been shortlisted for prizes like the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, the International Dylan Thomas Prize, and the story from this collection, Comorbidities, was a winner of the BBC Short Story Prize. Naomi, thank you very much for joining me on the Rippling Pages.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with Comorbidities, if you don't mind, and I appreciate that it's a story that's taken it's taken the sort of the literary world by storm, and it's a story that did win you the BBC Short Story Prize. And you can obviously see why. It's very apparent as soon as you start reading it. It makes you laugh, it makes you cry, and it makes you cringe to some extent too, as a married man and a woman try and find intimacy after the birth of their children. I just wanted to know, how has it been since you won this award, and why do you think it captured the imagination so much?
It's been so nice. I feel like, in your intro, like I hadn't been a stranger to being a shortlist on some prizes, but I had never really won anything. So I was very used to being the bridesmaid. And then when I found out that I was on the shortlist for this prize, and it's like the biggest possible prize, you can be eligible for in the short story world. When I found out I won, I was just like, oh man, this is so cool. And it's just been great. It's like opened a lot of opportunities for me. I think it basically got me an American publisher back because I didn't have a publisher for my third book over there, and really like just kind of put my name into the landscape of the short story because I wasn't known for being a short story writer. I think Comorbidities won because it does that sort of antic, manic energy approach to problems that are literally kind of 2023, 2024. So, the way that it's pitched is sort of like exhausted parents make a sex tape while the kids are at granny's. But, genuinely, that takes about 30 seconds in the story. And the rest of the story is about sort of low decibel anxiety, sometimes high decibel, where Mackenzie, the woman, is just like losing her shit over climate change and about motherhood and intimacy and mental health. And I think these are all not, I'm not like denigrating it as a like zeitgeist story, but I think these are all in the zeitgeist. And I think in its structure, it's kind of what my friend Andrew Cowan describes as like a cluster of anxieties rather than a single issue story. And I think those anxieties are very present and very contemporary. And I think maybe the judges also, they did say it was really nice to laugh. And I think, it's really hard to stand out in a short list of like 5 amazing stories. And I love the other 4. But mine was the only one like trying to be funny, and it's trying to be humorous. It's trying to make you laugh.
What's become quite sort of famous with it is this idea of the sex pie charts, and people are talking about these sex pie charts in the story, which is related to how the couple define how much time that they devote to different parts of their day, and they identify that they need some more space. And it is obviously the zeitgeist because it has captured the imagination so much. And one of the things that really, I've read it many times now, both because I've written a review about this book, but also because for the purpose of this podcast, and also because I love it. And I don't know if you'll agree with this. There's a kind of melancholy or sadness to it, and it just made me think about these people who are trying just really hard to make things work, and also to be creative to some extent. They're kind of a couple that are trying to create and be, try new things, whatever that is. For me, it really blew up this idea of what intimacy is. And by the end, at first it's sexual, intimacy, and it's about sexual intimacy. But by the end, it becomes a lot more about security when they start to have this kind of overwhelming anxiety about the leak of the sex tape and that kind of thing. It just felt like it was harkering something really kind of on a deep human level about the need for security and what intimacy can mean.
I mean, in some ways, like, it's positive, and maybe they have the best relationship out of anyone in the collection. And it's so hard. My friend Yen Ge, who is also a short story writer, was saying like, oh, and then shows up the like horrible husband in short stories. Like, you can't write happy marriages in short stories. But this one is happy. They genuinely like each other, and they genuinely miss each other. And I think that's where the sense of loss is from, because they're so busy trying to be caregivers to these kids, and they're also besotted with the kids. But they're also trying to be like successful human beings and not like screw up the planet. I think there's a sense of loss in the story, a sense of like maybe losing the planet as it is, losing innocence, because the internet is always like a presence in the story, that it's very slimy, it's very threatening, especially to Mason's patients, the teen sufferers, mental health sufferers, that he works with as a nurse. And yeah, there's this sense of like apprehension and dread, I think, and then it kind of makes it even more delightful that the couple in it carve out this very slender piece of pie that they think, okay, for 24 hours, we can maybe forget everything, close the door on all of those things, and devote ourselves to trying to love each other. And then, of course, it comes back. It's great that they tried. It's great that they made this intimacy with each other. And I think it's rare, or, I was conscious when I was writing the story that I really wanted to write about like a couple meaningfully engaging with each other rather than like fighting with each other, because it's a lot. And I think a lot of people go through this with young children, and it's maybe the time in my life I struggled the most in terms of like how my pie chart was and what I wanted my pie chart to look like, not just in terms of sex or intimacy, but like how much I was allowed to devote to labor or like other aspects of my life that I wanted to focus on.
But they're all kind of, the women are in different, is often women, sometimes pregnant, sometimes not, sometimes mothers, sometimes not. Why was it an explicit choice to have all those perspectives from, was that a conscious choice?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Not in the beginning, I should say. Like, I was writing these short stories, and I had been trying to write stories for a decade, and I just kept on failing. And then so they started off just like, a grain of sort of autobiographical truth. Like, this thing happened to me, and then I would try and make a story out of it. And I'm a mother, and so a lot of the experiences, the heart of the experiences start with something that I went through. And then as I was writing, I thought, oh, I think I've got like 4 or 5 now. And I thought, actually, there is a theme here. There's a recurring kind of character, or there's recurring characteristics in these women. Externally, they're mothers or they're expectant mothers. But there's a certain like internal, to some of them, I guess not all of them, there's a certain desire to kind of like break the rules of motherhood, to break the rules of what society wants as palatable or respectful or encouraged motherhood. And when I put the collection together, I did want 9 stories to represent the 9 months of gestation. It explores this type of woman who is both caring and loving and savage and toxic and charming, and she's very complicated. I didn't want to write sort of there's this idea of like motherhood books that they're either roses or thorns. Like, it's like Rachel Cusk like dismantling it, or someone else being a lot sweeter. But I kind of wanted to do both those things at the same time, because I think for me that's just more accurate, because I'm not like negative all the time. I'm not positive all the time. It's sort of this like meshiness, which is the experience of parenthood, I think.
Yeah. So what is that effect? What is that kind of, is it a kind of splitting? Is it conflict, or is it just a representation of the whole kind of the way the psyche works?
In some ways, like the book is a sort of fantasy of what would happen if I broke the rules, what would happen if I transgressed against the limitations of motherhood. And I guess like not just as a mother, but like generally I'm quite a nice person, right? And I find it really tiring. And then of course I have like sort of many repressed desires to be cruel or selfish or transgressive in a way that would come at a cost to other people. And I think the stories were a sort of exploration of like what would happen if these women did this thing that like I would never do. And it's a sort of pleasure. And I think for a lot of women, also guys, like there's how they've fed back to me is that there's an enjoyment in the delicious transgression of the characters, that they kind of, like with Leslie in therapy, she assaults the kind of very corporate counselor who is just pushing cliches at her, assaults the counselor, and it's just kind of like, oh yeah, madly, I would love to do that.
I think Leslie might be an exception, and some of the characters are exceptions in some of the acts. The director in Dracula at the movies, they do cross boundaries. But for people such as Mackenzie or many of the other characters, I don't feel that, I wasn't categorizing people as these are not bad people, these are not, bad mothers or anything like that.
That's the point, is that they're like complicated, and that they may, if you think about Deborah in Flatten the Curve, she's just like inwardly tormented, and she has thoughts about her neighbor, sexual thoughts. And, these are people who either act on the fantasy or we have their fantasies illuminated to us. But to me, that still feels like, yes, somehow transgressive or like rule breaking, because when I entered parenthood, like I was expected to have certain reactions, I was expected to have certain experiences. And I thought, oh, this is really like unsettling because I don't have those experiences or I don't feel those things. And so like when we reduce people into these like stereotypes, it becomes very difficult to be authentic or to be the complicated people that we are. So I think trying to like make complex those experiences, which are at their heart very complex, but have been like essentialized downward into like the joy of early motherhood or the unending pain of early motherhood. Well, to me, it's not like that. It's like you feel one thing for 10 minutes and then you feel another thing for 10 minutes. And then you're like fast cycling through a lot of really intense emotions.
You talk about people sort of being together, coming together, or sort of being split apart, or there's always this kind of people sort of referring to themselves as wanting to, or potentially feel, I don't know, a wholeness. And I don't think that's necessarily an aspiration.
I think so many of these women in these stories are like working out parts of themselves that have like died or been unattended or uncared for, maybe since childhood. And as they enter late 30s, 40s, that midlife transition of synthesizing or integrating some of those parts, that's where that desire comes from, I think, in some of the stories. So that's my therapeutic read on it. Some people have been like, oh, these women are so like grotesque. And I'm like, oh, I don't think they are. To me, they're quite relatable. Like they do weird shit and they think weird stuff and they kind of hate people. And it's like, well, of course, that's just normal.
Absolutely. And that's, I didn't read this as a kind of, I mean, obviously it's exceptional in the sense of that you've created a story about characters and things are blown up, but I kind of wasn't sat here going, wow, who are these?
Yeah.
Who are these women? Crikey.
Yeah.
But my friend Elizabeth over at Crib Notes And the quote she used, and the quote that she used, and that I thought was quite apt, is that these stories capture the contradictory, complex, and often fucking ridiculous facets of being a woman in a society rigged against us. We've kind of we've alluded to it, but there is a sort of pseudo scientific pandemic therapeutic discourse that sort of weaves into the stories. And through there we've also, think about things like sex pie charts and the title of that story itself, Comorbid, but also some of the way the characters speak about themselves. It seems to have lent itself from based
Yeah,
on
and really, like since the novels, I've become increasingly interested in sort of what I describe in my seminars as like register clashes, where there's lots of different types of languages flying around the fiction. There's a lot of like very informal and very like 21st century language in the stories, but there's also language which is informed by a lot of my reading on like therapy theory, because I like briefly thought I would retrain to be a therapist at one point and then gave that up. Uh, and yeah, like I read a lot of theory about the internet, which I still find completely fascinating, not about like AI, but about, and this sounds like really wanky, but like the internet as like a hyper object of like art. Like
okay.
and I just got really into all this weird stuff, and it just like all went into the book. Probably I couldn't even paraphrase it now because it was a few years ago that I did the research. But what I wanted in the stories was for them to have this sort of high-low number of languages or registers in the stories, that so that you feel like you are being taken on a journey into like real high culture and real low culture, because like, the kids watch TV, so like I talk about like kids TV, like Ninjago or whatever, and it's like talking about that culture, and then you can talk about like therapy theory or like the theory of the internet, and it's just kind of really interesting to me to like clash those things together, because I think it's a pleasure to read, and it's like our thinking about that sort of heteroglossia, that our lives are like made up of many different voices, and that it is a fabric of like lots of different languages, I think is more accurate a picture of like how we live, rather than like, I don't know, like I was describing to someone in my novels that I used to write in sort of like more established British literary fiction voice. And now I'm kind of trying to experiment with doing different voices.
We're gonna have a quick break on the Rippling Pages. Come back and we're going to talk more about Naomi's collection. This is why we can't have nice things. See you soon. With 3 novels under her belt and this short story collection, it's fair to say Naomi knows a thing or two about writing. Now, if you'd like to learn from one of the masters of the craft, why not sign up to one of Naomi's writing courses delivered by her? Find out more information on her website at www.naomiwood.com. That's www.naomiwood.com. We'll see you for the second half. There is, I wondered if this was because it was inspired by the pandemic, or there's some story set within the pandemic. If there was an idea of healing within some of these stories. We're talking about people, some of these characters are in therapy or use therapeutic terms. Are they trying to heal modern living?
That's a really interesting question. I think that most of the characters are not trying to heal. They're still in the like very benighted phase where they don't know what's wrong with them. Maybe they don't even know that they're acting badly. They're at an earlier stage where they don't have awareness. Thinking about the female film director who should be Me Too but isn't because of her gender, or Claudia in Hurt Feelings, who can't. She's got some grasp on why she's not healing. Most of them aren't taking steps toward a healthy kind of processing or resolution of their problems. They're still at that early stage, but I think they're like not brainwashed, but like they've absorbed enough of like wellness or like well-being culture that they kind of know what they should be doing, but they're definitely not.
That's interesting. Yeah, so kind of putting it in practice, maybe.
I'm trying to think of like who out of these characters like you could hang out with and think, oh, they are well-balanced individuals. I don't think they've got an awareness yet of like what has been split off from them and what they are suffering from, which is maybe some of that confusion that you were talking about. So I think they're quite far away from maybe like a therapeutic healing or a sense of resolution or a sense of like finishedness or like completeness.
Yeah, maybe healing's not the right word. Maybe healing is a bit. Are the characters, are they on a journey then, or is it more about a moment in time, if that makes sense?
Like a journey, I guess, sounds positive, and I wouldn't, or sounds like they're progressing or making progress with a journey, but these are kind of women in pain, right? Like when they're mothers of like very little children, when you're maybe like bodily most compromised, like a lot of the women are like trying to regain or trying to individuate from their babies and like stop breastfeeding and like try and kind of like thinking of the story as like a wedging open of like these private moments that are most often kept really private. And I kept on saying to myself when I was writing them, like, because I thought like, oh, I don't know if this is like a proper subject for literary fiction, like say the kept on thinking with like breastfeeding, like I don't know how much I'm allowed to write about this. And then I was like, well, would I like to read it? Yes. And am I annoyed that it's not in more fiction? Yes. Okay, so I'll like put it in. So yeah, private moment in time where the rewards of a journey are not necessarily given.
One thing I did want to ask is that there is, we know that you write about the pandemic, and you write about it really interestingly. And there was a sense, probably perhaps we were all a little bit fatigued by the pandemic, but it really brought it alive again in a way that I didn't know I wanted it to be brought alive again. Um, well, perhaps not especially flat in the curve, but just thinking about the stories that are set within the pandemic, that made me think about your novels. And I felt like your novels were kind of, for all the different things that they are, and they are very different, and they're very different to these stories. They're kind of parables about people who are trying to live together, whether they, within a same space, whether they should be or not. You've got Hemingway's wives who sort of bounce Hemingway around, and then you've got this kind of love triangle within the hiding game. The pandemic was surely a perfect setting for some of these kind of themes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I started writing this book in like 2019 and then finished in 2022. So like it was always there. Flatten the Curve is about a woman who is just trying to survive house arrest, lockdown, and like thinking about how much is based on yourself. Like there are just so many rich incidents. It was such a strange experience to be exposed to, that so many rich things happened. Me and my ex, we had like two kids at home, 1 and 5. We both had jobs. Like we were trying to carousel the kids and work throughout the day in these 2-hour shifts. I was like, this is fucking possible. But kind of there's so many like rich little incidents, and I hadn't thought that, yeah, in the novels there's also a sense of like claustrophobic endurance sport to like, can we all live together? And but that obviously that question, even when you start to ask that question, can we all live together, it presupposes a sort of like tension or conflict that somebody doesn't want to be there or somebody's thinking about somebody else. So the strainedness perhaps of relations in intense times, because obviously Weimar Republic was like really like lush and amazing, but sandwiched between these two wars. And the same with Hemingway, like and with that was very like conscious, because I was aware of all the Hemingway narratives of him as a like hyper masculinized, like go-getter, safari fisher, soldier dude. And my decision in that book was to always domesticate him. So all four of the stories are always in houses. Like, what happens when Hemingway is enwived or enhusbanded, and isn't allowed out the house in some ways.
It was claustrophobia, but it was also kind of sort of compatibility. And I don't know if this relates to some of the earlier things about different parts of ourselves and kind of how we have to live with different parts of ourselves as well that are, perhaps in conflict. It's just interesting because, yeah, but either whatever it is ripe for creativity, and it's a lot more interesting if they are together in.
Yeah, and I think thinking about like the couple in Flatten the Curve, like there's essentially a mutual loving bond there, and then she gets really bored and thinks she's some great queen of withdrawal and self, when you deny yourself what you want. So she thinks she's some great queen of this, and then she realizes she's not. She's got desires and needs, and she fantasizes about a way out, just as you suggested, like if there was a path out of this situation, should they take it? And because of the intensity, and that was such an intense situation when we were all in lockdown, right? Like barely memorable, because in some ways, like I feel like I've repressed a lot of it. But and it did come with its joys as well, I thought. But she fantasizes about a path out and then turns away from that fantasy. And I think that's the right thing for her to do, because she's got all this goodness around her. She's just getting destructive because of like really intense solitude and boredom, and like very dysregulated because of how the rhythm of her life has been completely denied to her.
I became very conscious of things. And when the reviews came out, other reviews, which I sort of reading, I was like, oh, these are a lot by women or, mothers. And but I related to it. I related to that kind of, it's hard to, you have all these cells, and sometimes you don't like who you are, and they live, but you've got to accept them, haven't you? Which is difficult.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good phrase. Sometimes you don't like who you are. So what do you do with that self? And like, the old me would like repress it or push it away. And the new me, or the older me, is like, okay, who is that person? Like, what is she asking for? Or like, why is she here? Why is she shown up in this context? Oh, it's because I'm frightened. It's because I'm anxious. It's because I'm like nervous or feel compromised or feel threatened. And that's where this like savage self is coming out. Like with Leslie in therapy, she's forced into this group therapy session, suffering with postnatal depression, and the therapist is prodding like a very unsubtle bear at like trying to get at those emotions. And Leslie acts very badly in that story, but she does so because like she's terrified. She's terrified that in this corporate workplace, which she sees as like total masculine, she's finessed in this place. She's pretty. She's like, she doesn't have to have these feelings, that she's going to be forced into that swampy motherhood where she thinks about killing her baby. And she's very frightened that that's going to come out in that session, and that's why she acts badly. So it comes back to this idea of like, why is this person who I don't like showing up in this specific situation?
Where are you going next? And then, has this kind of led to a sort of change in your thinking about how you write? Or
I mean, I feel generally obsessed with the short form.
Okay.
I think it's just totally like seductive, because the structure is super difficult. In terms of the storytelling, it's really so much, I find it a lot harder than writing novels, because you have to hit all of your marks and you have to hit them really cleanly. And there's nowhere to hide. Whereas in a novel, you might have a slow stretch or a like boring subplot, or things can be generally like a little looser in the tension. So something fails after 3 months, it's like, okay, it's 3 months work. But a novel is like 3 years, 4 years. You have to like completely invest in it for the long term. So I'm doing a BBC commission of 5 2,000-word short stories for next year. So I'm writing that, and that's all about women in space, female
Okay.
astronauts.
Astronauts, yeah, not a metaphysical.
Yeah, like yeah. So they're it's all about different women going up to space and having like kind of like very weird experiences,
Okay.
which is really fun. Trying to adapt this book into a pitch for TV. So merging some of the stories of This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things into a more synthesized story. So in my conception, it's Leslie in therapy, A, and Peekaboo. The three women in that now know each other, and they go on different journeys together. Sometimes they're based on the stories and sometimes not, but they're those characters. They know each other, they're friends, and their lives are kind of braided together. So this is like totally new for me, and a format and a form that I'm unfamiliar with. But it's kind of exciting to think about like a new life for these characters
Like
in a different format, in a different media.
Very
They all
exciting.
know each other.
Yeah, how
But it
exciting.
then
Naomi Wood, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things, your debut short story collection, award-winning short story collection. It's out now, published by Orion. Thank you so much for being on the Rippling Pages.
no, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you, Liam. Thanks for all your super interesting questions.